Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to Daring Dialogue. I am your host, Shante Charles. I want to thank you for tuning in to this broadcast, and I want to thank you for inviting your fellow followers. Hope everybody is having a great and wonderful morning. I spent most of my evening in pain, but thank the Lord, I don't have any pain this morning, and I believe I am healed. So hallelujah. But in spite of all of that, I did manage to get some rest, so I'm excited about that. And, as you all know, I keep it 100 over here on Daring Dialogue. So I'm just glad to be alive. Even if I did have some pain, I'd still be glad to be alive. This is one of my favorite cups. It says, "My boss told me I should dress for the job I want. What does a stay-at-home billionaire wear?" And the answer to that is whatever they want. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to be looking at our book, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise of European Capitalism. I want to say good morning to those of you who are coming in. Good morning, Lady Rochelle. Good morning, Pastor Ben. Good morning, Lady Barbara. This is episode 29, and the next time that we will be giving away gifts for a week will be once we hit episode 50. We just had a week of giveaways last week, and those things will be going out this week to those who won. All right. So we're going to be looking at, as I said, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust. And we're also going to be looking at leadership secrets of the Bible. We're going to finish up our talk with Job and integrity. And then I have a couple of dreams I want to share with you all that I had not been released to share, but I am now. And then also I had another dream last night, and this is just very unusual for me because I don't dream. Or if I do dream, I usually don't remember them. And usually when I remember them, they come to pass. So that's one reason why I feel like, with the Lord's permission, that I can share these. All right. So that is our agenda for today. And then now I want to talk about two things that God impressed that I thought were just really good nuggets. All right. The first thing, as I was just going about my day yesterday, I shared it with my husband, and I heard God say this about fame and favor, because there's been a lot of talk about those two issues. And he said to me, he said, "Do you know what fame is?" And I was like, "No, I don't know what fame is. I mean, I know people want it. I know some people have it." But he said, "Fame is manufactured favor." Just think about that. Now, I'm still going to be marinating on that myself, but that to me was a really good nugget to just take in and say law. Fame is manufactured favor. So when someone manufactures favor, they are in fact creating fame. And yeah, so I'm just going to say law on that. Then I'm going to move on to what he said to me this morning. So this morning I'm preparing and I'm getting dressed and I'm just moving around. And he said this. He said, people are creating, or they are building their entire ministry off of sensation. And I don't want to go into names because he didn't give me names, but I just saw images of people. And he said, "I don't want my people to build their ministry or to build off of sensationalizing everything," right? In other words, there are things that happen to you in your life that literally, there's so many charities and organizations out there that you could literally take anything that has happened to you in your life and begin to monetize it or to prostitute it. Whether it is something tragic that happens to you, whether it's a medical condition. So there's so many things that happen to us that we could take that and we could run with it and we can build our entire life off of what happened to us. But God said, I don't want you to do that. He said, I want you to build your life off of revelation. Somebody's going to get that. I want you to build your life off of revelation rather than sensation. Because guess what? Sensation will wear out. But revelation is eternal. So that was my morning nugget from the Lord. And I was like, got it. And again, that was a Selah moment for me. And so I'm going to continue to meditate on that thought of building around revelation as opposed to building something around sensation. Now, let's talk a little bit. Let's go back into what we were learning about Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust. Remember, last time we talked about 4 myths, okay? 4 myths that were going around that caused people to kind of justify why they were invading Africa in the first place. And I'm just going to briefly tell you what those myths are, and then we're going to go on to chapter 2, which is Africa before the slave trade. All right. The first myth was the myth of a people waiting in darkness for another people to bring them into light. That was the first myth. It said in most countries where the Europeans invaded or influenced, they actually put out the light of that local civilization and culture and destroyed their civilization. We just saw something that happened in the news this past week, going into this week, where some gold miners were, they actually murdered, I think they said 1/5 of a indigenous people group because they were after the gold that was on these people's land. And it has now become a world issue because the people were very small in number to begin with, and they have actually killed 20% of the people that existed, all because they were in someone else's territory stealing. All right. And I think it has become a world issue because at first there was some funding, and this happened in Brazil. There was some funding that was being provided for people to go in and protect what they call the uncontacted inhabitants. And that funding, I believe it had been diminished or decreased. So those people who were there initially protecting them from being contacted and being, from them being exploited, those people left the area, and that enabled these people to go in and start murdering the people. All right. And so again, where you have this level of invasion, all right, they actually put out the light of local civilizations, and it's, as you can see, it's still happening today. Number 2, the myth of a people without a legitimate God. All right. Most people, if they actually do their research, they will realize that there were Christians in Africa as well as Muslims in Africa, as well as the indigenous belief systems in Africa. So you weren't per se enlightening these people. Some of them had Christ before the Europeans had Christ. All right. Myth number 3, the myth of the primitive and the aborigine. All right. And we talked about how primitive and aborigine actually means the original people. It doesn't mean people that are less. It doesn't mean people that are ignorant. It doesn't mean people that are without knowledge. It doesn't mean people that are stupid. Okay. That's the Europeans' interpretation, but the actual words primitive and aborigine only simply mean the first or the original people to get there. 4, the myth of the invader and conqueror as civilizer. All right. Generally speaking, no people ever spread any civilization anywhere or at any time in human history through invasion and conquest. They only destroyed it. They didn't come to spread anything. They came to destroy and conquer. All right. So those were the 4 myths that we talked about last time. Let's go into Africa before the slave trade. And I want to say good morning to my love, Pastor Rock, who has stepped in for us for a moment to observe. All right, Chapter 2, Africa Before the Slave Trade. My approach to this subject on reflection might seem overly ambitious because most of the writers who have dealt with the African slave trade that began in the 15th and 16th centuries have not acknowledged that an age of grandeur came before this agony that changed Africa and the world for all time to come. When I speak of Africa's age of grandeur, I am referring to the last flowering state and empire building in the Western Sudan or inner West Africa, before the breaking up of the coastal states and the spread of the slave trade to other areas. This is the forgotten age of grandeur whose loss helped to make the West African slave trade possible. I generally divide African history into three arbitrary categories. There is nothing scientific about my method. It is a utility developed in order to simplify an overall approach to African history. In dividing African history into ages of grandeur that I call the first, second, and third golden age, I am saying to students that most people in the world who have had an age of grandeur or a golden age have had only one. As did the Romans, the Greeks rose and fell and never rose again. I maintain that African people have had three golden ages and could have a fourth one. What does this say about our potential and our ability to bounce back from defeat and decline and be a total people again? Now, if you go to my Daring Dialogues page, there is a powerful article on there that talks about the fact that the UN announced, they had to have announced it either 2014 or 2015, that 2015 to 2024 would be the decade of the black African, of people of black and African descent. Now the UN has figured this out, that this is our time. The United Nations, okay, have created a resolution that says from 2015 to 2024, it is the time of people of African descent all around the world. Now you mean to tell me the United Nations has figured this out and you call yourself a prophet and you ain't figured this out yet? I know I just stepped on some toes. Just put them back in. Where are the sons of Issachar? Are they all at the United Nations? I don't think so. But they have figured out that it is time for people to recognize, to appreciate, to restore the fortunes of people of African descent all around the world. All right? And so they commissioned, I believe he's a Haitian architect. I forget his name. It's on the article. But they commissioned this Haitian architect to build this sculpture that now sits in New York in front of the United Nations building. And he said that the image inside of it represents what he calls the Trinitarian soul of people that came over here through the Middle Passage. And the figure is supposed to represent men, women, and children that were affected by the Middle Passage. And it's made in a triangular shape to represent the slave trade, which if you look at it on many charts, it's in the shape of a triangle. Okay? But the UN has figured this out. The UN has called for the United States to pay black Americans for what they did to their ancestors. Now you mean to tell me the United Nations has figured this out and the United States hasn't figured this out yet? You mean to tell me that the United Nations makes this decree and all of a sudden we have this unprecedented resurrection of white supremacy in this country, and we can't figure out why we have this unprecedented resurrection of white supremacy in this country? We can't figure it out. Exactly. We are not repentant. And so I'm going to say it again. All right? I'm going to say it again, as they say for the people in the back. Whatever this country chooses to ignore in terms of reparations and in terms of paying back what they have done, God has a way of taking it out and redistributing it the way he wants to. He sure does. He doesn't need our help. He don't need our okay. He don't need our approval. He don't even need our opinion. But when God gets through with the United States, mark these words. When God gets through with the United States is going to be like Pharaoh. They're going to be like, here's the gold, here's the necklace, here's some cattle. What do you want? What do y'all want? Because the judgment of the Lord that will come for people who continue to ignore, all right, the economic bondage and the economic slavery that a group of people has been under in this country. When God makes a pronouncement and says, let my people go, all right, when God makes a pronouncement and says, stop oppressing my people, when God makes a pronouncement and you keep ignoring it, we know how God responds. All right. So I just want to tell you all, I'm not worried. I'm not concerned. Listen, God he's already made it known in the heavens what a nation owes a people in this country. Now he's letting the world declare, okay, what a nation owes a people. So now, if you understand spiritual principle, we got a witness in the heaven, and we have a witness on the earth of what you owe. Listen, so all I have to pray is, Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth, because the decree has already been made, as it is already in heaven. And then all I have to say is, God flip America, my home, sweet home. Right? That's all I got to do. So there's no need for me to get upset. There's no need for me to worry. There's no need for me to be all angry. Because you know what? God is the maker of heaven and earth. He said, all the silver and gold is mine. And anything else y'all want to make, including that Bitcoin, that's mine too. How about that? And when he gets ready to say, I want it all back, he's going to do that. And guess what? I'm just going to say, thank you, Lord. Oh, look at that. Wonderful. Praise God. Because God can do that. He doesn't need our approval. I know some people think he does. I know some people think that God is not going to move unless they write something legislatively for equality to happen. But guess what? The scripture says, listen, for such a time as this, if you have been put in power and you know the wrongs that this country has done to indigenous people, you know the wrongs that this country has done to people of African descent, and for such a time as this, if you have been put in power and you choose not to use your power to reverse some things that have been done that you know have been atrocities, and you choose not to use your power, guess what? God says, don't think that you're going to escape what happens. Because I got something for y'all. I got something for everybody that has been twisting the scales, that has been making the scales of justice unequal, that has been oppressing the poor, and you're in power, and you're not putting forth any laws, you're not putting forth any bills, you're not trying to change this, you're only fattening your own pocket, and you're fattening the pocket of the lobbyists who support you to keep the oppression going. I got something for all of y'all. Don't you worry. Let me continue. There is a need now to look back on Africa's golden ages and the main currents of African history that led to the decline of the last age of grandeur and the beginning of the slave trade. It can be said with a strong degree of certainty that Africa has had three golden ages. The first two reached their climax and were in decline before Europe was a functioning entity in human society. Africa's first golden age began at the beginning with the birth of man and the development of organized societies. It is generally conceded in most scholarly circles that mankind originated in Africa. This provides a basis for the theory that African man was the father and African woman the mother of humankind. In his book, The Progress and Evolution of Man in Africa, Dr. L. Leakey states that in every country that one visits and where one is drawn into conversation about Africa, the question is regularly asked by people who should know better, but what has Africa contributed to world progress? The critics of Africa forget that men of science today, with few exceptions, are satisfied that Africa was the birthplace of man himself, and that for many hundreds of centuries, Africa was in the forefront of all human progress. Math, science, astronomy, philosophy, Africa. That's where it came out of. And then you had the Greeks and the Romans came in. They got some wisdom, all right? Then they went back to their territories and began to teach and to spread that wisdom, sometimes as their own. In the early development of man, the family was the most important unit in existence. Let's say that again. In the early development of man, the family was the most important unit in existence. And it still is. Through the years, the importance of this unit has not changed. The first human societies were developed for reasons relating to the needs and survival of the family. The early African had to make hooks to catch fish, spears to hunt with, and knives. He searched for new ways of building shelter, gathering and raising food, and domesticating animals. Our use of fire even today simply continues the process started by the early Africans, the control of fire. In the making of tools that sets man apart from all living creatures, Africans started man along the tool-making path. With the discovery of metals and how to use them, all Africa took a great leap forward. Man had learned how to take iron from the ground and turn it into spears and tools. Iron cultures began to spread rapidly across Africa, and if you've ever taken a history course, they call it the Iron Age for a reason, right? They have the Bronze Age, they have the Iron Age, all right? And there were very few parts of Africa that were not influenced by these Iron Age cultures. Iron cultures had their greatest development in the area of Africa that is now the eastern Sudan in a great city-state of Meroe, M-E-R-O-E. The use of iron accelerated every aspect of African development and introduced a new danger, the eventual use of iron weapons in warfare. The Nile River became a great cultural highway, bringing people and cultures out of inner Africa. These migrations by river led to the establishment of one of the greatest nations in world history, and most of us know Egypt, all right? In his book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, Great Issues of a Race, from 4500 BC to 2000 AD, the African American historian Chancellor Williams refers to Egypt as Ethiopia's oldest daughter. Let's see. I actually have that book. And let's see if I have. Yes, I do. All right. This book right here. If you don't have it in your library, you have needs to get it. Hint, hint. All right, so the destruction of black civilization, great issues of a race from 4500 BC to 2000 AD. All right. In this book, he's talking about Egypt as Ethiopia's oldest daughter. And you can screenshot this if you need to. All right. And calls attention to the evidence to prove the Southern African origin of early Egyptian people and their civilization. Egypt first became an organized nation about 6000 BC. Medical interest centers upon a period in the third dynasty when Egypt had an ambitious pharaoh named Zoser or Zoser. And Zoser or Zoser in turn had for his chief counsel a minister and brilliant commoner named Imhotep. Most people have heard of Imhotep if you've done any level of study on Egypt. All right. Imhotep, whose name means he who cometh in peace. Although Egypt gave the world some of the greatest personalities in the history of mankind, Imhotep stands out. In the ancient history of Egypt, no individual left a deeper impression than the commoner Imhotep. He was the world's first multi-genius recorded. Let me just say that. He was also the real father of medicine. Imhotep constructed the famous step pyramid of Saqqara near Memphis. Yes, terms like Memphis, terms like the White House actually originated in Egypt. All right. And the building methods used in the construction of this pyramid revolutionized the architecture of the ancient world. In his book, Evolution of Modern Medicine, Sir William Osler refers to Imhotep as the first figure of a physician to stand out clearly from the midst of antiquity. The period in Egyptian history from the third dynasty to the first invasion of Egypt by the Hyksos or Shepherd Kings in 1675 BC is, in my opinion, the apex of the first golden age. The Western Asian domination over Egypt lasted about 420 years and was ended by the rise of Egyptian nationalism during the 17th Dynastian era. It would later develop into a state with a known history of more than 1,000 years. In Europe and in the Arab countries, Ghana was known as a country rich in gold. This was a natural attraction for the Arabs and then later for the Europeans. The country reached the height of its greatness during the reign of Tenkamenen, one of its greatest kings who came to power in 1062 AD. The king lived in a palace of stone and wood which was built to be defended in time of war. The empire was well organized. The political progress and social well-being of its people could be favorably compared to the best kingdoms and empires that prevailed in Europe at this time. The country at this time had a military force of about 200,000 men. In one of a number of holy wars or jihads, Ghana was invaded by the Almoravides under the leadership of Abu Bakr of the Soso Empire, Sosso, in 1076 AD. This conquest brought an end to Ghana's age of prosperity and cultural development. The character of the country was slow to change. Nearly 100 years later, the Arab writer El Idrisi wrote of it as being the greatest kingdom of the blacks. In a later account, El Idrisi said, Ghana is the most commercial of the black countries. It is visited by rich merchants from all the surrounding countries and the extremities of the West. In 1087, Ghana regained its independence, but without regaining its old strength, state organization, and grandeur. The ruins of the Empire of Ghana became the kingdoms of Diara and Soso. The provinces of Ghana became a part of the Mali Empire and were later absorbed into the Songhai Empire. The great drama of state building, trade and commerce, and power brokerage unfolded at Timbuktu, the queen city of the Western Sudan. 200 miles down the Niger from Timbuktu was the competing city Gao, Gao. It was founded about the 7th century AD, and the capital was the capital of the large black empire of Songhai. Like Timbuktu, it was in a favorable position for the trans-Saharan trade in the days of the regular caravans from North Africa. Also, like Timbuktu, the greatest days of Gao came in the 15th and 16th centuries. In the years when Timbuktu was a great intellectual nucleus of the Songhai Empire, African scholars were enjoying a renaissance that was known and respected throughout most of Africa and in parts of Europe. At this period in African history, the University of Sankore was the educational capital of Western Sudan. In his book, Timbuktu the Mysterious, Felix Dubois gives us the following picture. The scholars of Timbuktu yielded in nothing to the saints and their sojourns in the foreign universities of Fez, Tunis, and Cairo. They astounded the most learned men in Islam by their erudition. That these Negroes were on a level with the Arabian savants is proved by the fact they were installed as professors in Morocco and Egypt. In contrast to this, we find that the Arabs were not always equal to the requirements of Sankore. The famous emperor of Mali, which a lot of people already know him, Mansa Musa, stopped at Timbuktu on his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. He went in regal splendor with an entourage of 60,000 people, including 1,200 servants. 500 bondsmen, each of whom carried a staff of pure gold, marched in front of the emperor. 280 camels bore 2,400 pounds of gold, which this African king distributed as alms and gifts. Musa returned from Mecca with an architect who designed imposing buildings in Timbuktu and other parts of his realm. To the outside world of the late medieval period, the Emperor Mansa Musa was more than an individual. He was Africa. He conquered the Songhai Empire and rebuilt the University of Sankore. He figured by name on every map. In his lifetime, he became the symbol of the mystery and the fabulous wealth of the unknown African continent. He was the most colorful of the black kings of the 14th century. He still held this position nearly 2 centuries after his death. After the death of Mansa Musa, the empire of Mali declined in importance. Its place was taken by Songhai, whose greatest king was Askia the Great, or Muhammad Touré. Askia came to power in 1493, 1 year after Columbus landed in America. He consolidated the territory conquered by the previous ruler, Sani Ali, and built Songhai into the most powerful state in Western Sudan. His realm, it is said, was larger than all of Europe. The German writer Henry Bath, in his famous work, Travels and Discoveries in North and Central Africa, calls Askia the Great one of the most brilliant and enlightened administrators of all times. He reorganized the army of Songhai, improved the system of banking and credit, and made the city-states of Gao, Walata, Timbuktu, and Guinea into intellectual centers. Timbuktu, during his reign, was a city of more than 100,000 people, a city filled to the top, says a chronicler of that time, with gold and, of course, dazzling women. We're going to stop there. But what is the point? The point is, if you were to believe American history, if you were to believe our interpretation of history, nobody has ever been great except the Europeans. That's the problem. Now, if I'm wrong, somebody put on the screen, Shantae, you're wrong. All right? But if you have had a public school education in the United States of America, I guarantee you, you have not really heard about Mansa Musa. You haven't heard about the African kingdoms that already existed way before the European kingdoms. You haven't heard about these kings that were already established and people that were already established and scholars and professors and universities that were already established before Christopher Columbus. Why? Why haven't you heard? Exactly. You learned it as an adult. I learned it through my own research in college, digging through the library. All right? Till it got to the point where they said there were certain books I could not check out. Bing, bing, bing. One of my friends who was at Hampton University, and I had another friend at Howard University. He wound up checking out a book, and apparently there was some kind of restriction on it. This was when I actually found out that even though something is in a library, you don't necessarily have access to check it out. Okay. Some works require a certain type of security clearance for you to check it out. Now they kind of show this in movies, but back then you didn't know anything about that. And so he wound up checking out a book, and that same day he had authorities knock on his door to retrieve the book. They said, you don't have clearance to check this book out. And they took the book and brought it back to the library. How about that? That was my first time that I understood something ain't right. They say knowledge is power, right? Knowledge is power. And if you don't go to your local library and you don't have a library card, let me just put a plug in there. Please go to your local library and read and check out books and research and see what your local library has. And please make sure you get a library card and turn your books in on time. Signed, former librarian and librarian assistant. Integrity. That's where we're going now. All right. I'm not going to get through a whole lot today because I do want to share those dreams with you all. So if you all can hang on for about an extra 10 minutes, I do want to make sure that I share those dreams and get through them. Okay. Integrity despite temptation and adversity. We left off talking about Job. All right. And I want to just finish up this section on what he says here about Job. Job, the book of Job, it is one of the longest books in the Bible, an extended debate on integrity, humility, and discipline, and how these are to be applied in the real world. So if you want some real world application of integrity, humility, and discipline, read the book of Job. If you've been feeling sorry for yourself lately, all right, if you have the woe is me's, read the book of Job. It will cure you of the woe is me. The patience of Job is legendary. What is often forgotten is his integrity. Job was a recipient of every calamity known to God and man. First, he had every single one of his oxen and donkeys carried off by a marauding tribe called the Sabaeans, who then put to the sword every one of his servants. To compound matters, all his sons and daughters were killed when a windstorm collapsed the house in which they were feasting. Maybe it was a hurricane. We don't know, but they call it a windstorm. Finally, Satan afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet all the way to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. Talk about hitting rock bottom. Here is a man whose trials parallel or surpassed any modern leader's sufferings. He had owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a large number of servants. In other words, we know back then that livestock was money. I mean, it's still money today, but even more so in that time because that's pretty much how they were, doing commerce, right? He had lost all 7 of his sons and daughters. If any man could be pardoned for temporarily or permanently deserting his principles, it would be Job. Even his wife suggested he was a gullible fool for sticking to these principles. Remember, she said, "Are you still holding on to your," keyword, "integrity? Curse God and die." She didn't say, "Are you still holding on to your faith?" She said, "Are you still holding on to your integrity?" And so a lot of times I try to tell people, the enemy is not after your faith. He's after your integrity. He's after the thing that holds you together. All right? That's what he's after. But Job repeatedly refused to give up his integrity. "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? As long as I have life within me," he said, "my lips will not speak wickedness. I will not deny my integrity." The modern leader may undergo many trials, but few of them as devastating as Job's. In a sense, all that he had left was his integrity, and he was determined to hold on to it. Leaders in all ages should realize that whether the coffers are bulging or whether they're empty, whether the flock is increasing or whether the flock is dwindling, integrity is the measure of leadership. Consider Randall Tobias, CEO of Eli Lilly. When his company went through some difficult times in the mid-1990s, he did not seek a pure mathematical model for cutting costs. He considered the overall impact of the company on the individuals who had in many cases spent their whole lives working for the company. Rather than dismiss them, he offered early retirement and 1 year's pay. Bill Adams, CEO of Armstrong World Industries, takes an extremely personal and proactive approach to integrity at his company. He gives every employee his personal phone number and tells them, "Call me personally if you are ever asked to do something you consider wrong." His motto is not "let the buyer beware," but "let the buyer have faith." But some people never learn. One of the most dishonest men in the Bible is Judas Iscariot, one of Jesus' disciples who betrayed him, mostly out of greed, perhaps also out of jealousy. Judas realized he had none of the healing powers, communication skills, or ability to inspire others positively that his boss had. He knew he was never going to be the boss or even the boss's right-hand man, but he could make an impact by betraying the man many believed to be the Son of God. Judas's lack of integrity was noticed even before he betrayed Jesus. If you go back and read the story, read the Gospels, you will see little traces here and there of Judas's character being noted in Scripture. One of them had to do with he started complaining about people wasting their oil on, paying worship to Jesus. That was one instance. Then there was another instance where he got angry and he was saying, we could have used that to fill up our coffers, basically. We could have used, I think it was perfume at the time. He was saying we could have used it and sold and gave money to the poor. But then the scripture noted that wasn't really the heart of Judas. He was just kind of saying that, but his real intent was, we want the money. So you have to watch people like that. Judas's lack of integrity was noted. People who lack integrity usually show it in a variety of situations. At a dinner in Jesus' honor, a woman took a pint of expensive perfume and poured it on Jesus' feet. Guess which disciple objected on the bias of integrity? The one who lacked it the most. Judas Iscariot, who complained, "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages." He did not say this because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into the money bag. This is identified in John chapter 12, verses 4 through 6. The example of Judas shows how it takes only one dishonest person or one discontented person with bad intentions to severely derail a cooperative effort, particularly when that person is at or near the top. He just said a word. All it takes is one bad apple at or near the top. A modern leader who feigned empathy toward the poor while he was enriching himself at their expense was William Aramony, former CEO of the United Way. And now, unfortunately, we have the same thing going on with the Red Cross. The organization that historically has helped the modern equivalent of the widow, the orphan, the blind, the halt, and the lame. Aramony, who was making $400,000 per year, was discovered to have misappropriated a large amount of the organization's funds and resources for his own personal benefit. So he was already making $400,000 a year, and then he was stealing on top of that. Lack of integrity. Next week, we will look at acting with integrity, and we're going to look at Jeremiah, and we're also going to look at Nehemiah, and then we're going to look at systems and safeguards. Systems and safeguards. All right. Hope you enjoyed our readings for today. And now I want to talk to you about some dreams. All right. We might be able to get through them in time. All right. I tend to write my dreams down. The third one, because it happened last night, I have not written it down yet, but I will. This first dream I had was Saturday, September 2nd, 2017. And in this dream, there was a multi-level high-rise building. And in this multi-level high-rise building, there were classes. And it was like a high school, but in a high-rise. And it was like classes on every level. In the dream, there was a student that was killed. I don't know how he was killed or whatever, but a student was killed. And I saw in this room where they had the student who was deceased. In the room, they were conducting some sort of autopsy on this student. And he was immersed face down in water. Then my dream switched almost to like it was the next day. And in another part of the building, students were kind of talking about what had happened to this student. Again, they didn't give any details. They were just kind of mentioning the fact that this student was no longer with them. And they were getting ready for class. It was a classroom setting, kind of like those old school single desks. And then the scene in the dream switched back to the student who had at first been face down and submerged in water. Once the scene switched back, this dead student was actually getting up. All right. He got up in front of the examiners almost like he had been resurrected, but he was in a zombie-fied state. He appeared to be, some sort of miracle, but once the examiners kind of looked him over, they let him go, even though he seemed to be not physically looking like a zombie, but very much like in a zombie state of mind and being. He was moving very slow. All right. Then the scene in the dream switched back to the school, and students were still talking about this student, but now they were talking about the fact that they heard that he was alive and that he would be coming back into the classroom. At this point in the dream, I am just still pretty much like outside of the dream, but observing it. I'm looking into this dream. All right. So at this point, I'm fulfilling the role of an observer. After this happens, after the kids in the dream, the students in the dream are talking about this student returning to the class, all of a sudden I am fully submersed in this dream as a character in the dream. All right. And I'm in the classroom. The students are calling him a miracle. All right. So I'm standing near like the teacher's desk. There's students in front of me, and to my left is the open doorway, and then there's another open doorway on the other end of this classroom. So there's two exits. All right. The students are calling him a miracle, and then suddenly he comes into the classroom, but I look at him and I notice he doesn't look right. Something's not right about him. All right. So he looks at me, he fumbles a greeting towards me, and then he tries to like side hug me like he was a regular student. But then I looked him in his face, and there was like veins moving beneath his skin. And then I heard something whisper, all right, inside of the student saying, "Tell them you're okay." And then I realized this is not the student speaking, but I stay calm, okay? So I realized this student is possessed with something, and this is gonna turn ugly in a moment, okay? The description of the student, he was a tall, I recognized in the dream, I remember from the dream that he was a tall, thin black boy, and he was probably about 6'4". So it was really tall and thin, and I kind of had to look up at him. Before the bell rings, all right, because the students were kind of settling down. It was like at the beginning of class. Before the bell rings, he steps outside and he says he'll be right back. All right. So I watch him walk out of the classroom, and he walks back down the hallway. And there's a few minutes, I'm thinking in the dream, before, the bell rings and he's late or whatever. So I step so I can see him in the hallway, but also keep my eye on the students. And I'm still looking at him in the hallway. And next thing I know, I see him putting on a wig like a woman. And then he looks up at me with this super evil look in his eyes. And I realize he's about to initiate something. All right. He looks possessed at this point. I look back at the students. Okay. And in the dream, the students were like all creeds of students, male and female. And I point to the opposite door and I tell them, literally, I yell, "Run." Okay. They immediately get up and they start running. He knows what I am doing, so he begins to run back towards the classroom. And as he's running back toward the classroom, he says, "It's okay." And then he names a really, really famous female preacher, all right, who has been in the news lately. I don't want to call her name. But he says, "It's okay. Such and such is waiting for them on the next level down." And then the dream ends. And so, okay, I'm waking up. I'm freaking out. I'm like, okay, this is this is something else. Because again, I don't remember dreams, but I remember all of this detail about this dream. And so as I began to pray into it, I was asking the Lord, what does this dream mean? And if God is giving you something else or some insight into this dream, please feel free to email me at reachante@gmail.com. But these are the things that the Lord gave me in terms of insight into this dream. Number one, of course, the building represented learning. All right. The students, he said, represented the next generation of learners in the body of Christ. The student turned into a zombie represents those who have been infected with false teaching. And because he had been infected with false teaching, he was resurrected to come present himself as a teacher to the students, which was why he was in the hallway and he was trying to change his appearance. All right. So he was coming to present himself as a teacher to the students. And there was also a spirit that had to deal with gender. All right. Because not only was he coming to present himself as a teacher to the students, but he was also trying to disguise his actual gender. So there was a spirit that maybe had to do with a feminism attached to this false teaching. All right. So that spirit was working alongside the false teaching spirit. And then he said this, he said the next generation of teachers and the next generation of learners is who this spirit is after and trying to infect. He was coming to devour the next generation of teachers, but he wanted to get them as students. There are false teachers, and when this entity said it's okay that they're trying to escape, because in other words, even if they escape that level and they try to escape the building, all right, there are false teachers on different levels. That's what he was saying. Oh, it's okay if they escape my classroom because there's another false teacher waiting for them on the next level. Which is not very encouraging, but we need to know this, right? And so this spirit feels confident that if he doesn't get to them, another false teacher will. And so for me, this dream was a warning about the false teacher and the spirit of the false that has been loosed on this generation. And that those of us who are called to teach the gospel, or those of us who are called to teach the truth, we have a responsibility to safeguard and protect those who are in our care from false teachers and false doctrines. All right. So that was dream number 1. Anybody have any questions? Shortly thereafter, a few more days after that, I had another dream, and this was a completely different dream. This dream had to do, this is actually my second dream on anything in our country having to do with nuclear threat. Okay. This dream had to do with a nuclear threat. And let me see. I drew it very lightly, but I want to make sure you all can to see this. All right. So I'm just drawing over it again. I was in this dream, and the landscape was that like a major city, and I could look down the road. I was standing, had to be at my own building, okay. But if you see this kind of looks like a vantage point, and I was looking down the road, and you could see all of these buildings and high rises, okay. And there were cars on the street and people walking, etc., etc. And in the distance, there was some kind of, I don't know if it was a resistor or transistor or reactor, whatever you call that. But I'm just drawing it so you can see it a little bit better. It was off in the distance, and it was high enough over the buildings that you could see it from afar, okay. I'm down here somewhere, okay, down in this area, and I was standing looking out into the distance. Looked like a city, somewhat of a cityscape, but then there was this tall thing, like I said, I don't know if it was like a power plant or a water tower or whatever it was, but anyway, as I was standing, I saw some little plane, I don't know what it was, or some object fly into this tower, and the tower blew. That's why I don't think it was a water tower. All right. The tower blew up, and then all of a sudden the tower caved in, but then the explosion started coming toward me and coming toward us. And those people who were in the streets turned around and started running towards me. All right. As I was standing where I was at almost like an open door, and I began to signal for people to come into the building where I was, because the building where I was in the dream had a basement, but the basement was almost like a bomb shelter. Okay. And at first, people were coming in to the building, and then there was this one woman, Caucasian lady, kind of heavy set. She at first did not want to come into the building, but then almost right as the explosion started coming past our building, then she finally wanted to try to come in. But by that time, I was trying to close the door, because I was like, look, if you don't want to if you don't want to be preserved, then that's on you. But she finally yanked the door open and came down with us to this like bomb shelter like area. And we were all standing down there. Again, it was people of all different races and creeds. There was some children, there was women, there was men. And then the dream ended. So this is my second dream I have had about something hitting in the United States that caused some kind of fallout, some kind of nuclear fallout. And so for this, I just ask people to keep this in prayer, because we already have threats of nuclear fallout and war, and I don't want to be a part of that. So I believe that this dream was a warning for intercessors to continue to intercede on that, and to not think that it's not possible, that it can happen, and that those of you who do pray, to not take this lightly, okay? To not take the threats of other countries lightly against the United States, but we need to be praying. We need to also be prepared to escape something like this. We also need to be prepared to hunker down with other people. And then we also need to be prepared for people who don't want to be preserved should something like this happen. All right. So that was dream number 2. I'm almost done. Dream number 3 last night was pretty awesome. I was like, man, this is wonderful. And in this dream, I was getting ready to give some kind of presentation. I believe I was like getting ready to preach or something. And the venue almost looked like a movie theater. And right as I was getting ready to minister, people started coming in, and they were all people that I recognized. And I was like, wow, what are you people doing here? And they were people that I have ministered with in the past. There are people that I have been in church with in the past, either serving or whatever. And they all, for some reason, came to visit me at the same time on the same day. So as they were kind of settling in, some of them were musicians, there was a drummer, some of them were just, regular ministers. And so they were just kind of like finding their seats. And as we were getting ready, 3 white men walked in, and they all came to approach me. And one was kind of tall and lanky. One kind of looked like, had like a biker garment on with the jacket and the bandana. And then one was kind of a middle-aged older white man. And they all came to me with these pamphlets from the Ku Klux Klan. They were Klansmen. I was like, yes! I don't know why I was so excited in this dream. But they weren't wearing robes, but they had the paraphernalia. And one of them had almost like this Klansman manual. And they wanted to talk. And so they sat down with me and they began to talk with me. And then another minister who ministers on race and religion, he appeared in the dream. And as I was talking to these men, one of the men said in the dream, he said, "This is what I have been taught." And he said, he pointed to the white supremacist pamphlet, and he said, "They told me that this was my book of life, and that in order for me to be saved, I had to be found in this book. And so in the dream, I was explaining to him that that book was not the Bible. Okay. And then I started breaking down to him, what is the book of life? What does that mean to have your name written in the book of life? And as I began to do that, those who were around began to talk and to minister to the other two men. And then the minister, who also I know, in real life teaches on race and religion, he began to like prepare food and things to feed these three men. And at the end of the dream, you could kind of see that something in their minds had been broken off of them, and they were like in fellowship with the people now, and they were willing to hear the truth. And at the end of the dream, they were no longer holding on to their pamphlets that they had come in with to address us. And so I woke up very, very encouraged by that. Because that has been my heart, is to see people delivered from doctrines of devils. And believe it or not, that is a doctrine of devils. And so I believe that God gave me some insight from that dream as to why they hold to those principles. Because if you think that your salvation is in keeping those doctrines, if you think that your salvation is in proving that you're the superior race, if you think that your salvation is in following the tenets of white supremacy, Lord have mercy. So again, I want to encourage people who are dealing with those who follow the doctrines of white supremacy. I want you to begin to pray that God will open up the eyes of their understanding, so that they would know that their salvation and that their eternity is not tied to those doctrines, and that God would begin to break that mentality, to break that spiritual stronghold, to break that teaching off of them, so that they can receive truth. All right? Because the truth is, everybody's going to be in heaven, not just white people. All right? And believe it or not, there are some doctrines, there are some white supremacist doctrines that say that people of color will be serving other white people in heaven. They actually teach that. Okay? So, in closing, I want to say thank you all for listening to me. Thank you all for hearing my dreams. Those of you who have dreams, I encourage you to write your dreams down, pray over them, ask God for insight into what he is saying to you and sharing with you. And again, if God is giving you any additional insight into the dreams that I just shared, please feel free to share it with me at reachshantae@gmail.com. All right. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness. So go out and be light, spread light, share the light of Christ with others today. Thank you again so much for your time and attention. I hope that you will join me tomorrow for Wisdom Wednesday, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, same place, same grace. God bless. Take care.